tidings, for which I call upon the House and the nation.
Dass wir intolerante, unverträgliche Menschen seien. Wir wollten sagen,
It was surprisingly hard for me to conceive when I walked the peaceful, picturesque beaches along the west coast of northern France for the research of this book and the related documentaries that they were the setting for the remarkable, never-to-be-forgotten Normandy landings. The beautiful sands are known as the Côte de Nacre, which poetically translates as the mother-of-pearl coast, and the beaches are awash with poignantly moving memories of that auspicious and historic day when thousands of Allied troops came ashore on June 6, 1944. The events that took place there are celebrated as D-Day. Without doubt, this daringly heroic and ultimately liberating invasion marked the beginning of the end of World War II. Since September 1939, when war broke out, for the Allies, victory and the prospect of peace was a distant and often uncertain dream. Somewhere in the future, as Adolf Hitler and his axis of evil stormed to power across Europe. But by 1942, the mists of doubt had slowly started to lift, and the vision of a world free from tyranny began to emerge. And although, up until D-Day, the war could still have swung in Hitler's favour as preparations were made, fortune seemed to have been smiling on the Allies for some time, firstly in North Africa, and then across the Mediterranean into Italy. Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. Prime Minister Winston Churchill spoke these words after the British 8th Army had triumphed against Erwin Rommel in the Second Battle of El Alamein. The Allies were at last making progress, and although months and years of conflict still lay ahead, the tide was definitely turning their way. Now, although the events of North Africa have been covered in detail in earlier chapters, it's worth taking a moment for a brief look back, as the key players in the D-Day landings were already emerging. This gives us the opportunity to discover a little more about the backgrounds of the remarkable heroes of Operation Overlord who played such key roles in the Normandy landings. The First Battle of El Alamein had been far from conclusive. The Allied forces did battle with the Germans from the 1st to the 27th of July 1942, with the outcome being a stalemate at a cost of some 13,000 Allied casualties. Even though this war was far from ideal, the British still managed to take 7,000 prisoners and damage Hitler's North African campaign. Rommel's plans to advance to Alexandria and then Cairo were stalled, and this impasse also put a stop to Germany gaining control of the Suez Canal and many Middle Eastern oil fields, which would have had grave consequences for the Allies. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery took over the British Eighth Army in August 1942. And it was his insight and initiative that proved to be the downfall of the Nazis in the second battle at El Alamein. Using his experience of fighting in the First World War, Montgomery could anticipate and almost predict what was going to happen and managed his campaign accordingly. Fortunately for Montgomery, the air support he received was outstanding when compared with the German Luftwaffe and Italy's Regia Aeronautica, who instead of supporting their ground troops became embroiled in air-to-air combat. Overall, Allied casualties were less than half of those suffered by the Germans, which were 30% of Rommel's men, and he had no other option but to retreat, moving the remainder of his army to Tunisia, where better defensive action could be taken. Winston Churchill famously described the 14-day battle at El Alamein that ran from October 23rd to November 5th, 1942, as not being the end, not even the beginning of the end, but perhaps the end of the beginning. Was certainly the point at which the Allies started on the road to victory, with the colourful characters of Rommel, Churchill and Montgomery all gaining valuable experience. With the battle for North Africa over, the Allies could springboard into Europe across the Mediterranean, and the island of Sicily was the next target. The Allied invasion, codenamed Operation Husky, was a mix of amphibious and airborne warfare, with the aim of removing both the Sicilian Air Force and Navy, giving the Allies access to the whole Mediterranean. German intelligence had no knowledge of the invasion plans thanks to a decoy of documents planted on the corpse of a British officer stating that the Allies had no interest in Sicily. The papers claimed the next invasion target was to be Greece, so most of the German defences were relocated. Paratroopers were the first to invade just after midnight on July 9, 1943, but due to very strong winds, many landed miles off course and in the wrong order, but the confusion actually proved to be very positive. When the beach landings began, Allies faced very little opposition. But by July 13th, resistance had grown and the losses and casualties began to escalate. The remarkable American general George Patton, who was the commander of US 7th Army and equally as outspoken as Montgomery, captured the capital, Palermo, which proved to both the Italians and the Germans that Sicily had fallen, and they promptly retreated. Hitler's forces managed to evacuate the whole garrison in Messina, and because the Allies were at this point superior in the air and at sea, Germany's swift evacuation came as something of a blow, as they had failed to make the most of the situation. The individual charged with controlling Montgomery and Patton was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and his task was far from easy. As progress through Italy was slow, the tensions between Montgomery, Patton, and another American, General Omar Bradley, escalated, and it took all Eisenhower's diplomatic skill to prevent a war breaking out between his generals before the fight against Hitler and the final push for victory could begin. The The invasion of Sicily heralded the Italian campaign, but there had been some disagreement between the Americans and the British about strategies for ending the war, with President Roosevelt and the USA determined to liberate France first and foremost. However, Winston Churchill was of the opinion that Italy needed to be dealt with and taken out of the war as quickly as possible. As the Allies slowly battled on in Italy as 1943 wore on, the plans for a full-scale invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe gathered momentum. The Russians, who were holding firm against Hitler in the east, attended the Tehran Conference, along with the British and the Americans, bringing together Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt for the first time since the Soviets had become part of the Allied operation. The time had come to put the final strategy to defeat Adolf Hitler in place, beginning with the invasion of France, codenamed Operation Overlord, and Dwight D. Eisenhower was once more the man selected to take charge as Supreme Commander. He would need to draw on the experience of the likes of Montgomery and Patton if the mission was to succeed, pulling together the various personalities, and as the Normandy beaches were selected as where the D-Day landings would take place, there was a great deal to be done in a short space of time. Early in 1944, Anglo-American relations became tense when Montgomery insisted that in order for there to be success in Normandy, the original plans of 3 Allied divisions must be increased to 5. This would certainly curtail the American plans for Operation Anvil to play a major role in the invasion. Eisenhower was keen to create a diversion with an army from the Mediterranean landing on the Côte d'Azur in the south of France. But Churchill and the British were strongly against this, and felt if resources were concentrated in Italy, Rome would fall to the Allies sooner. Churchill even wrote to President Roosevelt asking that many of the landing ship tanks, better known as LSTs, be transferred from Operation Anvil to Operation Overlord. This dispute continued for some time, until events in late April 1944 took the issue out of the Allies' hands as our story of D-Day begins in earnest. Preparation would be key if the invasion of Normandy was going to be successful, and the 50-mile-long landing beach zone would have to be split up into sections if a beachhead with adequate ports was to be established at speed, allowing the Allies swift access to the heart of occupied France. It was decided that the American Army divisions would land closest to Cherbourg on beaches codenamed Utah and Omaha, while the British and Canadians would land on Gold, Juno and Sword beaches along the stretch of coastline leading to Caen. Rehearsing for the invasion was vital, and the Americans, who were due to land on Utah Beach, were involved in a practical mission codenamed Exercise Tiger. A similar stretch of Devon coastline was selected at Slapton Sands, as 30,000 troops were put through their paces, but then disaster struck. German E-boats from Cherbourg attacked and torpedoed 5 landing ship tanks, which dealt a bitter blow both to Operation Overlord and Operation Anvil. At the beginning of the war, Churchill had requested that great ships be built that could cast upon a beach large numbers of the heaviest tanks in any weather, and the LSTs certainly did just that. but the losses at Slapton meant the postponement of Operation Anvil in order to give as much support to D-Day as possible, and with 700 men lost, the disastrous rehearsal was also a human tragedy. Even so, as D-Day came ever closer, exercises like Tiger were still a necessity, despite the dangers. Because of the sheer size of the operation, there was a great disparity in the experience and level of training between the various soldiers, sailors and airmen called upon for D-Day. Apart from those who'd fought in the North African and Italian campaigns, many of the American divisions were being sent straight from the USA and would be only able to take part in a few weeks of intensive training on British soil. Without doubt, the Air Force, Navy and assault regiments would have to practice effectively and cooperatively in order for there to be a successful outcome to D-Day. If the troops were to be prepared as possible, terrain had to be found that resembled the 5 Normandy landing beaches, along with Slapton Sands, the Gower Peninsula, the Tarbat Peninsula, Culbin Sands and Burghead Bay were also selected. Because these sites were used for military training purposes, all the villages, farms and rural communities needed to be evacuated, and quickly. Hundreds of people from each location had to leave their homes as more Allied troops from all over the world gathered in Britain, ready to invade France. Before long, the south coast became a huge training and embarkation zone, with every eventuality planned for during April and May. As well as men, vast quantities of ordnance and military vehicles were required, but most important of all, every move that was made needed to be kept secret. Hitler and his generals knew full well that an attack was imminent, but one of the most astounding things about D-Day was the way in which Allied counterintelligence managed to keep the details of the invasion such a secret. This was crucial to the success of Operation Overlord, and as much careful planning went into this part of the proceedings as into orchestrating the actual landings. A far-reaching system called Bigot was introduced to keep a check on who held complete information about Operation Overlord, and the amount of Bigot officers was kept to an absolute minimum to prevent any information whatsoever leaking out. Naturally, as time went on and the operation drew ever closer, the different forces needed to be briefed on the types of area they would be going to. But the fear of this information spreading was so great that anyone who knew the planned locations was kept under strict supervision, and in some cases kept behind the kind of barbed wire fences you would expect to find in a concentration camp. At the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, otherwise known as SHAEF, the disastrous events at Slapton Sands had given them unexpected cause for concern, as 10 Bigot officers were among the 700 men who lost their lives along the Devon coast. A large-scale, grueling mission was ordered to find all 10 of the officers, because there was every possibility that they could have been carrying Bigot paperwork, or worse still, been captured and interrogated by the Germans. Eventually, all 10 bodies were found, and SHAEF could continue with Operation Overlord, safe in the knowledge that their secrets had not been compromised. But this was far from being the only scare they had to deal with. One US Major General was enjoying drinks at a London hotel and, without thinking, complained that he couldn't get any supplies through until about June 15th, after the invasion. Needless to say, he was returned to the United States very quickly indeed. And it wasn't just careful talk that Scaife had to worry about. In the lead up to D-Day, Wind blew 12 copies of bigot documents out of a Whitehall office. Security officers had to risk all to dodge the traffic so that each one was collected. Then, as if the weather hadn't been enough to contend with, a worrying coincidence seemed to arise in the 33 days leading up to D-Day. Words connected with the operation were answers to crossword clues in the Daily Telegraph newspaper. The names of the landing beaches, Utah and Omaha, cropped up, as did Neptune, which was the code name for all the naval operations involved, along with Mulberry, the artificial harbours that were planned for the beaches of Normandy. But most worrying of all was the clue Big Wig, the answer to which was Overlord. Immediately, the retired school teacher who had set the clues was brought in for questioning, as he was suspected of being a Nazi spy who was tipping off the Germans. However, he convinced MI5 of his innocence, and this has gone down in history as one of the most bizarre coincidences of World War II. Scaife were right to be so cautious. The entire outcome of the war and many thousands of lives depended upon secrecy, and when a railway employee at Exeter found a complete set of Overlord plans in a briefcase abandoned in a train compartment, it proved without doubt that ensuring information did not pass into the wrong hands was a major undertaking. However, keeping the invasion plan secret was only a part of the process. There was a great deal of effort put into feeding the Germans incorrect information, and it worked very well indeed. For a start, the most logical route for an Allied invasion would have been between Dover and Calais, and Scaife did everything possible to make sure that this is what the Germans were expecting. For every reconnaissance flight over Normandy, 2 were flown over the Pas de Calais, as well as floating dummy landing crafts in the Thames estuary and the Channel ports to add to the deception. These diversions became so complex that the project of disinformation was even recognised officially as Operation Fortitude. It proved to be totally believable, and Rommel, who Hitler had put in charge of defending France from any Allied invasion, was certainly convinced, keeping his troops concentrated around Calais, leaving Normandy open to attack. As D-Day fast approached, it was also essential that the French resistance be told that the invasion force was on its way. They had worked tirelessly since the fall of their nation back in 1940 to obstruct the German occupying army in any way that they could.
Hello, forces. Once again, this is Joan Griffith saying...
Consequently, 2 coded messages were broadcast by the BBC on the 1st and then the 5th of June. The long sobs of the violins of autumn, followed by "Wound my heart with a monotonous languor." Far from being secret, the chief of German intelligence had been warned of the significance of these bizarre words. But when Rommel was told, he believed it preposterous that the Allies would announce their operation plans over the radio, and dismissed this as being a part of the elaborate disinformation strategy. A great deal of thought had gone into planning the perfect date for Operation Overlord, and as Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Force, Eisenhower had considered everything from weather and tides to phases of the moon. A full moon would be essential for light, along with a spring tide, and initially June 5th was settled on. Nevertheless, when the weather turned unseasonably stormy, the Allies faced an incredibly difficult decision. Eisenhower knew that if he postponed for longer than a day, the operation would have to wait a whole fortnight for conditions to be right again. Already there had been so many close calls, and who could say whether it would be possible to keep their plan secret from the Germans for a further 2 weeks. Plus, there was now the issue of the thousands of men already aboard their ships, prepared for their mission. Not only would it be difficult for them to disembark without it being noticed, but they'd also have to be accommodated until the invasion could go ahead as planned. Eisenhower did, however, have the option of postponing until the following day, when the weather forecast, even though still dreadful, was slightly more promising. It was a very risky decision, but to everyone involved it was definitely a chance worth taking, even though the sea crossing would be far from pleasant for the troops. To help with seasickness, the soldiers had been advised to chew gum. But with the appalling weather that came with the dawn of June 6th, it was of little help. The only plus point was the fact that the weather was so bad, the Germans had ruled out any chance of an invasion. Rommel had been so confident that he'd left France and returned home to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. Operation Overlord began in 2 phases. The first being an air assault, while the second was the amphibious landing of Allied infantry. The second phase was hugely dependent on the success of the first, as the airborne bombardment and influx of troops would build up a support force ready to ensure a swift breakout from the beachhead. The air assault landings of British and American troops happened shortly after midnight, in the first few hours of D-Day. This was not only to secure the rear of the beachheads, but also to neutralise as much opposition along the shoreline as possible. It was strategically vital to capture 2 bridges north of the city of Caen at the British and Canadian end of the landing beaches, as they provided the Germans with an opportunity to attack from inland. Also, the bridges needed to be secured intact, as they were necessary if there was to be a smooth breakout from the beachhead. The most famous of the crossings was originally called the Bénouville Bridge, which was over the Caen Canal, but is known today as Pegasus Bridge, because it's where the British 6th Airborne Division, led by Major John Howard, had the first success of D-Day, after landing their wooden hawser gliders perfectly on target. The name change came because Pegasus, the proud flying horse, was the insignia of the 6th Airborne Division, who were responsible for liberating the first of the French towns at Bénouville shortly after winning the battle for Pegasus Bridge. The Allied airborne attack continued as planes from the US Air Force set off from the south of England to secure the northwestern perimeter and prevent any German counterattack towards the Cherbourg end of the landing beaches. As part of the German defences, Rommel had flooded as many areas as possible that could have been suitable for parachute landings, and had also scattered hundreds of mines and the famously named Rommel asparagus. Quite often, those who were lucky enough to avoid the dreaded asparagus often drowned under the weight of their heavy kit bags in the thick swamps that Rommel had created. For months, the D-Day planners had to struggle to find the best landing beaches in Normandy, and the invasion was due to begin at the most westerly stretch of shoreline, Utah, running for some 3 miles and located between Poupeville and La Madeleine. As the Allied troop ships began to gather, the weather that had made the journey so uncomfortable for the troops proved extremely fortuitous, as the German E-boats sent out from Cherbourg had to turn back to port. This gave the 30,000 American troops and 3,500 vehicles that were in position at 2 a.m. and ready to fight at the first light of day almost a clear path into the area. The airborne forces, despite so many of them landing off course, had also played their part, and one of the best-known films about the Normandy landings, The Longest Day from the 1960s, features these early events and one story in particular. Just a short distance from Utah Beach lies the charming town of St. Mère-Église. In the early hours of D-Day, 13,000 paratroopers dropped from the skies, one of them being a Private John Steele, who has gone down in history as a result of his most unfortunate landing. Steele's parachute became entangled with the fine steeple of the imposing church, leaving him to dangle helplessly. For 2 hours he managed to limply hang on, pretending to be dead, but the Germans eventually spotted movement and he was taken prisoner. A dummy paratrooper still hangs from the steeple to this day, as a reminder of the incredible bravery of so many Allied servicemen as they gave their all to liberate France. But some of the troops involved in the fight to gain control of Utah Beach were a great deal more fortunate than Private Steele. Another contributor to the D-Day history books was Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, the eldest son of the former President of the USA. Despite being 57 years of age, as division commander, he requested he be allowed to lead his men ashore in person, and although advised against such action, he was granted permission and landed on the beach with his troops. However, because of the strong current and massive amount of smoke caused by the initial assault, Roosevelt's infantry landed a mile off course to face only a handful of German soldiers who could do little to defend against this unexpected Allied advance. Roosevelt is famously quoted, when told of the error, as having said, "We'll start the war from here," which he promptly did, leading the advance inland. Ironically, the part of the beach where the troops were supposed to have landed was heavily defended, and many more lives would have been lost had things gone to plan. Roosevelt certainly took full advantage of the situation, and his quick thinking and strategic intellect earned him the Medal of Honor. The successful landing at Utah was better than Eisenhower could have possibly hoped for, especially as there were only 197 Allied casualties, and only 4 out of the 32 tanks sent ashore were lost. These figures were a credit to the skill and courage of all those involved in the landings, with the added advantage of luck very definitely playing its part. Nevertheless, the airborne forces paid a much higher price, with the real cost of gaining control of Utah Beach being borne by the many paratroopers who were killed or captured. They were clearing the exits for 5 hours prior to the Utah landings, causing sufficient confusion to prevent a German counterattack. Unfortunately, by the end of the offensive, the 101st Airborne Division had lost 40% of its fighting force, which, coupled with the men also lost in the Slapton Sands tragedy, meant that the Americans suffered a great deal more at Utah than the casualty figures at first suggest. Today, the invasion at Utah is remembered for the very positive start it gave to D-Day, heralding the liberation of France. There are many proud monuments along this most significant stretch of beach, and the popular Utah Beach Landing Museum is a wonderful place to visit, especially for those who want to know more about the incredible events of that June morning back in 1944 in person. But the relatively straightforward triumph at Utah could not have been more difficult than the disastrous and very bloody battle that took place at the neighboring beach of Omaha. The objective was for American troops to secure a 5-mile stretch of coastline that would eventually link with the British forces landing at Gold Beach. But just as all went in favor of those landing at Utah, the exact opposite happened to those destined for Omaha. For a start, navigational difficulties due to the weather worked against the invasion force, putting them directly in the line of fire of the very experienced German 352nd Division, who just happened to be on a training exercise in the district. By this late stage in the war, with so many of Hitler's troops engaged on the Eastern Front fighting with the Russians, many of the troops defending the French coast would otherwise have been schoolboy conscripts. As well as the misfortune of a strongly defended position, an error of disembarkation had further disastrous consequences when 29 tanks were released from their landing craft too early, causing 27 of these essential support vehicles and their crews to sink, leaving the men clambering ashore even more vulnerable to enemy fire. It's difficult to comprehend what it must have been like, particularly if you look at the quiet beach today, but this vivid account from an eyewitness certainly leaves us in no doubt as to how horrific the scene must have quickly become. Within 10 minutes of the ramps being lowered, A Company had become inert, leaderless, and almost incapable of action. Every officer and sergeant had been killed or wounded. It had become a struggle for survival and rescue. The men in the water pushed wounded men ashore ahead of them, and those who had reached the sands crawled back into the water, pulling others to land to save them from drowning. In many cases, only to see the rescued men wounded again or to be hit themselves. Within 20 minutes of striking the beach, A Company had ceased to be an assault company and had become a forlorn little rescue party bent upon survival and the saving of lives. Even so, the fighting spirit of those brave Americans shone through. And as companies who had become separated regrouped, while the lower ranks stepped forward to replace their commanders who had fallen, advances were slowly but surely made. It was a real team effort, with the engineers clearing pathways across the beach and up the steep hill, working under intense fire, which frequently set off the explosives they were attempting to defuse, and the casualty rate was high. American losses were horrendous, but the Germans also took casualties of about 1,200, which accounted for about 20% of the 352nd Division. French, as they enjoyed the prospect of liberation, they also had to face the dilemma of how to deal with the fallen, whether friend or foe. Needless to say, having been oppressed by the Germans since 1940, it took some time for there to be a spirit of peace and reconciliation. But if you visit the graveyards along the coast of Normandy today, you'll see how a dignified solution was eventually found for this problem. At Le Combe, the German cemetery, more than 21,000 soldiers lie beneath the ground, the majority of which fell between D-Day and August 20th, 1944. Each small square commemorates up to 4 men, some of them no more than boys, and the sheer volume of sombre black stone crosses stands testament to the tragic loss of life experienced on all sides throughout World War II. The cemetery is managed today by the German War Graves Commission. It was completed in 1961, but since this time, any German remains found from the conflict are brought here to Le Combe to rest in peace. It's interesting to note that across this rural landscape, this is still quite a common occurrence, where so many lost their lives during the invasion of Normandy. While the casualties of the aggressive German army are buried without pomp and circumstance, the contrast of the American National Cemetery and Memorial, appropriately located high on the cliffs above Omaha Beach, where so many US troops were killed, couldn't be more marked. The brightly gleaming cemetery contains the remains of 9,286 soldiers in over 70 acres of land. There are 30 pairs of brothers buried together here, including Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt of Utah Beach fame, who died of a heart attack just over 2 months after the invasion on July 12th, alongside his brother Quentin, who had been killed in France during the First World War. The 22-foot bronze statue at the heart of the cemetery is entitled "The Spirit of American Youth Rises from the Waves," and along with neat rows of bright shining white gravestones is as thought-provoking as the Teutonic somberness of Le Combe. As well as being charged with taking the beaches of Utah and Omaha, the Americans were also given the task of attacking Point du Hoc, a strategic headland under German control. It was believed that a large gun battery was located at the summit, with the potential to be a significant threat to the landing forces as they came ashore. The plan was for the 2nd Ranger Battalion to land at the base of the 100-foot cliff face and climb to the top, where they would then destroy the gun battery that had the beaches of Omaha and Utah within firing range. Under the command of Colonel James E. Rudder, the brave Rangers battled hard under fierce attack to reach the top, while the Germans from their high vantage point had the distinctive advantage. Out of the 225 men who took on this perilous operation, 135 were killed, injured, or listed as missing in action, making for a 60% casualty rate. Then, to add insult to injury, the surviving Rangers who made it to the top found that the anticipated big guns were nowhere to be seen. The guns were finally found some distance away in an unguarded apple orchard and immediately destroyed. Moving ever onwards and into the British and Canadian sector, the next landing beach along from Omaha was codenamed Gold. The objectives for the troops here, along with those landing on Juno Beach, was to liberate the town of Bayeux, secure the Caen-Bayeux road, and occupy the port of Arromanches. The bombardment from the battleships at sea began at 5:45 a.m. and the landings took place 5 minutes earlier than scheduled at 7:25. Just as had happened at Omaha, there were difficulties getting the allocated tanks ashore because of the weather conditions, and they had to be launched early due to the heavy seas, resulting in a dozen of them sinking before they reached the shore. Even though the troops experienced some heavy resistance in the early hours, they managed to break through the German lines, only sustaining casualties of around 400 men, compared to the thousands of lives lost at Omaha. After securing gold, the British troops managed to join up with the Canadians, who had landed on neighbouring Juno Beach, next along the coast, but were unable to complete their primary objective of reaching and securing the Caen-Bayeux road. Today, Gold Beach is an idyllic holiday location, and as people enjoy the seafront hotels, cafes and restaurants, thoughts of D-Day may be far from their minds. However, looking out to sea, there are plenty of reminders of those auspicious events. Arromanches is a charming town, but on June 6, 1944, it was of vital importance as a port, and from here you get a superb view of the remains of the Mulberry harbours that the Allies constructed soon after the landings. When planning Operation Overlord, the Allies quickly realised that both the American and British sectors would need harbours to ship in supplies once the beaches had been secured. Port-en-Besson lay between the two sectors, but it simply wasn't large enough to handle all the equipment that would be needed at great speed. So the idea of constructing floating harbours was conceived, made up of component parts that could be towed across the English Channel in the wake of the invasion force. The two harbours were constructed at the far end of Omaha Beach and at Arromanches, codenamed respectively Mulberry A and Mulberry B, and they were surprisingly large, being similar in size to the harbour at Dover. Each of these temporary constructions required 600,000 tons of concrete, along with about 10 miles of floating roadways to cope with the flow of traffic. Unfortunately, the American Mulberry A was smashed to smithereens by more unseasonable weather in a powerful storm on June 19th, and this proved to be a major setback. Luckily, Mulberry B at Arromanches remained intact despite the terrible conditions, and it is the remains of this amazing construction that can still be seen along the shoreline today. Mulberry B proved to be incredibly efficient and was used to land over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles and 4 million tons of absolutely crucial supplies, and bearing the title Port Winston, it was as steadfast and dependable as the British Prime Minister it was named after. Returning to the invasion beaches, our next port of call is Juno. And this is where some of the most incredible footage from June 6, 1944 was actually shot. Interestingly, there were around 50 camera crews recording all the landings on D-Day, which is a staggering figure, especially as they faced the exact same dangers as the troops they were filming. At Juno, the soldiers of the Canadian 3rd Division had been selected to advance into one of the most heavily defended stretches of the Normandy coastline. The earlier bombardment of this area was of little help to the troops, as the Air Force had failed to cause significant damage, and the advanced naval attack that ran for an hour and a half only destroyed a small percentage of German bunkers. Nevertheless, about an hour after landing, the Canadians had cleared the German sea line but had sustained heavy casualties. However, by evening, they had still pushed several miles inland and secured the town of Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. The final Allied assault was on Sword Beach, following on from Juno. Sword was the furthest east of all the beaches, and only a matter of miles from Caen, and securing this key town was a primary objective for the collaboration of the British 3rd Infantry Division and the 27th Armoured Brigade, who landed here. Unlike Omaha and Gold Beach, although heavily mined, the resistance on the beach was minimal, but the relatively small, concentrated landing area, combined with the swift incoming tide, meant that the operation became very hazardous as the thousands of men and equipment came ashore. As the troops advanced inland, the resistance grew stronger, and it wasn't long before the Germans' 21st Panzer Division was sent to Sword from Caen, and it took the Allies until evening to neutralise them. However, this escalating conflict meant that Caen could not be reached as planned, and the two groups of Allied infantry were stalled on the outskirts of the city. This may not have been the most straightforward of landings, but the indomitable spirit of the advancing Allies was unmistakable, as each and every one of them played their part in the liberation of France. One of the most incredible stories told of the events at Sword Beach is that of Piper Bill Millin of Lord Lovat's first Special Service. As he stepped out, waist-deep, into the water from the landing craft, he started piping his own rendition of Highland Laddie. As the beach became littered with the corpses of the fallen, amongst all the smoke and confusion, Piper Millin continued to play. In fact, it's said that he piped all the way from Sword Beach to Pegasus Bridge, where Lord Lovat's men joined the British troops that had been the first to land in France on D-Day. There were many tales of incredible heroism, as the days of June 1944 saw Operation Overland forge further ahead towards the very heart of France as it was being liberated from Hitler's tyranny. Against all the odds, by the end of D-Day, 130,000 Allied troops had occupied the stretch of coastline between Cherbourg and Caen before Hitler's generals had even realised what was happening. The casualties had been significant for the Allies. On Omaha Beach alone, 3,000 brave Americans had lost their lives, yet the end of the war was now very definitely in sight. Hitler was far from finished, but the chances of a German victory were disappearing fast as June 1944 drew to a close. For the Allies, morale was at an all-time high, and as the success of D-Day was built upon, the dream of restoring peace to a free world was just that little bit closer to becoming a reality.